This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Welcome to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond and episode 1 of our brand new series number 2, and a happy new year to you all, and of course a happy new format as we move to our new premiere broadcast of 10 AM on a Saturday morning.
Before the football.
Yes, before the football, but also at the same time as many of the cookery programmes which grace our screens on a Saturday morning, some of which are quite good, some less so. But now we intend to entertain as well as inform about all things Scottish. So what do we have in store this week, Alex?
Well, Tasmina, we've got a 700-year-old mystery story. It's the real stone of destiny at the bottom of the River Tail in a cave of Perthshire, or there's the 700-year fake, which has occupied so much attention. In reality, still the stone of destiny. And we'll get the whys and wherefores and the whereabouts of the fragment of the stone as the latest twist and turn involving that great relic involved myself.
Well, we can look forward to that, and also we have one last opportunity for you to enter our massive competition on Scotland's Hidden Heroes and the chance to win very much sought after memorabilia.
And what's more, we move to our next series of Scotland's Hidden Heroes, and a really topical choice given the subject matter of today's programme. Today's hidden hero is King John MacCormick of Scottish Covenant fame, a man who led the national movement in the late 1940s and 50s.
But now to this week's show. Alex was in the news over the last couple of weeks after the release of Cabinet Papers from 2008 showing an exchange between himself as First Minister and the then Permanent Secretary, Sir John Elvidge.
The minute indicated that I'd said at a cabinet meeting and told Sir John Elvidge, the Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government, that I'd been given a fragment of the stone by Professor Neil MacCormick, the son of John MacCormick, and Sir John Elvidge saying that Historic Scotland didn't really want that fragment.
Well, that was more than enough to set Tory pulses a-racing, and a procession of toffs line up to demand that Alex return the fragment, and even that he had stolen it.
Which is a bit much, considering the reality is that the stone was stolen by Edward Plantagenet, Hammer the Scots, in 1296, and repatriated by an act of daring do from 4 young Glasgow University students in Christmas Day 1950. So in Scotland Speaks, you hear the real history.
And the correct terminology. Well, coming up after the break, Alex picks up the tale with the wonderful historian Owen Dudley-Edwards, who explains the significance of the pinch of 1950 in the annals of modern Scottish nationalism. We shall see you shortly.
Welcome back. Now I'm delighted to be joined by one of Ireland's greatest ever exports to Scotland, the historian Owen Dudley-Edwards. Owen, welcome to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you very much. It's a very great honour.
Now, Owen, today's subject, the stone of destiny, the stone of... What exactly, where did it come from? Where did it really come from? What was its significance?
Well, it came from the fact that Ireland and Scotland are in some ways the same country when you get into mythology. So, supposedly it began with a sacred stone on Lia Fáil, and that it was in certain ways possibly taken over by Irish migrants to Scotland, by Irish invaders, and by Irish missionaries like St. Columba, taking it to Iona, perhaps, getting it into Scotland itself, and as Scotland became more and more Gaelic-speaking, it became central to the identity of the kingship.
So give us a pronunciation again of the Gaelic.
On Lia Fáil.
Meaning literally the stone of destiny.
Stone of destiny.
So it comes to Scone for about 300 years. It's part of the ceremony, the sanctification of Scottish kings. And how important was it as a symbol in that era?
So far as we know, quite important, but of course we know very little about its reception. It becomes front and centre stage when it's stolen, and I mean that, by King Edward I, who was denying the identity of Scotland even as a separate country.
Yeah, I want to come to that. I mean, why did Edward Plantagenet, memorably played by Patrick McGoohan in Braveheart, nasty piece of work, but why was he so interested in seizing a lump of sandstone?
For the reason which is so often given by presidents and prime ministers, security, that it'll justify anything. In his case, he was anxious to assert his authority over Scotland as a kind of super king. In doing so, he got himself to become a consultant when 13 nobles were fighting to become the new king of Scotland. And as such, he recognised John Balliol. Then when Balliol proved restive and somewhat independent after 4 years, 1796, and Edward's response was to steal the Scottish records, steal the holy relic of St. Margaret, the Queen of Scotland, and steal the Stone of Scone. The point was, by taking all those down to England, you denied an identity to Scotland at all. It was simply an outback.
This shows a degree of sophistication. I mean, Edward could be very unsophisticated. I mean, he was slaughtering all the garrison at Berwick. He was slaughtering the Flemish merchants. He was hanging this one. He was doing whatever. But in addition to this ruthlessness of suppression, he was also going for the propaganda, for the records, for the identity of Scotland.
Yes. William Robertson, the greatest historian of the Enlightenment, said that the malicious policy of Edward had destroyed the historical identity of Scotland before his time, and it was deliberately done to falsify. Now, Edward was a very great legalist. He knew how to create parliaments. He created the ones in England and in Ireland. But at the same time, when thwarted, he was absolutely ruthless, and as such he was also a ruthless thief of the past. He invented his own versions of history and had them written so that Scotland would remain permanently subject and whose identity disappeared. He had, of course, done the same thing with Wales, but he had been more successful there in a ruthless subjugation, including subjecting the bards.
So the Stone of Destiny, the Stone of Scone, is pillaged by Edward. He makes a new coronation chair down in Westminster Abbey. He planks his backside on it. But it doesn't work. I mean, because, having lost its stone, Scotland finds itself, and Robert de Bru triumphantly becomes King of Scots. So the plan didn't, the devious scheme, the cunning plan didn't work out.
Very much not, since after Edward, his son Edward II, beaten at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and then just at the time when Edward II is being murdered, the attempt is made, either by his murderers or by his heir Edward III, to have the stone returned to Scotland, and there were riots in London, so that it caused English nationalism.
Well, it's a very potent symbol indeed. So for the best part of 700 years, the stone of Scone is underneath the coronation chair. The suffragettes tried to blow it up, or maybe tried to blow up the chair. And then what happens on Christmas Day 1950?
Whereupon 4 or 5 young persons, one of them a woman, decide to steal the stone from Westminster. And because, of course...
No, I've got to stop you there. Steal. I mean, this word steal, how can you steal a stolen object?
Well, if you like, we could say to make away with. No, what is happening is, no, of course it wasn't stealing from that point of view at all, and Edward I was a thief. As far as these young persons were concerned, they didn't steal it in any sense of wanting to make possession of it themselves. They wanted to restore it to Scotland. So it was, if we're going to be fair about it, a very straightforward return after all those centuries, justice.
So the Ian Hamilton, Kay Matheson and their confederates, by various adventures, managed to get the stone over the border amid a massive hullabaloo of international publicity. I mean, this caused quite a sensation at the time.
Very much so. I was a boy growing up in Ireland at the time, and the place was convulsed. Everybody was in stitches of laughter, for one thing. Nobody in Ireland, I think, was anxious to suggest that it could belong to anybody but the Scots. Various professional patriots jumped in and claimed their association with it. One of the most delightful things was when it was discovered that Scotland Yard was trying to get the stone back from Scotland. And so you heard popular songs, "O Sherlock Holmes' deed lang syne, Wayne said dismal garret, and 'tis as well ere he her tell o' Superintendent Barrett."
But this is a sort of, I mean, there was a wonderful film in 2008 which tells the story. There was a very good documentary by George Reid, the former SNP MP, when he was a television journalist. But I just wonder why all this amazing kind of folklore of the 1950 pinch, the escapade, has sort of been lost from modern Scottish nationalism.
Well, in a certain sense, Scottish nationalism begins in various fits and starts, beginning at National Party of Scotland 26, and then becoming the Scottish National Party, and then Dr. McIntyre being elected in the by-election just before 1945, and then MacCormick's father, John MacCormick, the former secretary and boss of the SNP, now having started this great crusade to get signatures in favour of a separate Scottish literature and getting a separate Scottish legislature and getting tremendous interest in it, and for something to take off, this proved to be the great symbol of a Scotland that could come back and be a nation again.
So John MacCormick, the head of the Covenant, formerly the secretary and guiding light of the SNP, had fallen out with the SNP over the cross-party covenant, the popular covenant, very much one of the inspirers of the whole process of repatriating the stone. And of course, crucially, the father of Professor Neil MacCormick, Regis Professor of Law at Edinburgh University, one of your colleagues at Edinburgh University, who happened to have a fragment to give me back in 2008.
And one of my most beloved and admired colleagues. He was, of course, also the brother of Ian MacCormick, the SNP MP, who was elected in 1974. Neil MacCormick was one of the greatest scholars Scotland has ever produced. As a philosopher of law, he was admitted throughout the world as being without peer. He also had a tremendous sense of humour. He also had a tremendous patriotism, a wonderful fairness, an extraordinarily good teacher. Anybody, or indeed a marvellous lecturer. It was an utter delight to know him, and he summed up his belief in Scotland by saying, to understand what the Scotland means, read Hugh McDermott's introduction to the golden treasury of Scottish poetry.
Now, I think we can reasonably assume that the academic and professional qualifications of Sir Neil MacCormick an honorary Queen's Counsel, knighted by Her Majesty the Queen, the real Queen, were probably somewhat greater as a professor of public law than, for example, Alistair Jack, the current Scottish Secretary of State, who believes that he, and therefore me, stole this fragment of the stone. How would you rate, as an academic, Owen Dudley-Edwards, how would you rate the relative qualifications of Sir Neil MacCormick on the one hand and Alistair Jack on the other?
I don't want to be rude about mice, but it is comparing a lion to a mouse.
So Neil MacCormick gave me the fragment, I gave it to the SNP. It's in the SNP head office now, and they've kind of admitted to it being there. What do you think should happen to the fragment? Should it go into the general exhibition that's going to be in Perth for the Stone of Scone, or might there be a more appropriate place, that perhaps one that celebrates the great escapade of Christmas Day 1950?
With Glasgow having had a tremendous, as the birthplace of so much Scottish oratory, so much Scottish politics, so much Scottish learning, so much a people's university reflecting its own hinterland so well, and today with leading Scottish academics who've done so much to advance the identity of Scotland in culture, literature, law, etc., where you have people like Murray Pittock and Nigel Leask. This legacy, which Glasgow powerfully expresses, I think it's only fair that it should be honoured, this great 15th century university, that it should be honoured by receiving the stone, the fragment of the stone that there is.
One thing there was, we started this interview talking about Edward Plantagenet and what was his motivation for stealing that historic relic. Is there something, I want you to tell me, why do you think that the repatriation of the stone in 1950-51 had such an impact? And what lessons could Scottish nationalism learn now from the symbolism that Edward I understood and used against us? Is there something for modern Scottish nationalism to understand about symbolism and nationality?
It is a question of recovering it. There was a readiness after World War II to say, oh, nationalism is over, it doesn't apply to anything, it's great powers time. And people seeing the great powers to come into existence through the war and then in 1945 by exploding atomic bombs. And a natural reaction for so many people around the world to say, we want something smaller. We want something where we can control our destinies. We don't want to be leaving things in the hands of supermen and thinking only of them instead of ourselves. And with John MacCormick having had this tremendous crusade to get signatures for a separate Scottish identity, it was very natural that it should lead. What are we going to get results? Well, there was a symbol in having the stone coming back. And what was also terribly important was that it was all terribly funny. Everybody was enjoying watching the authorities making idiots of themselves. And given the extent to which Scotland had been almost eliminated once again, but it wasn't going to be important nowadays, suddenly discovering a Scottish identity as expressed by this wee magic stain was a marvellous thing, and people produced their various songs and so forth. And so Scottish nationalism begins to rise again. John MacCormick had been a successful candidate for the rectorship of Glasgow, and you began to discover you young Scottish nationalists emerging and building up the party until ultimately, of course, 17 years later with Winnie Ewing and Hamilton, you got the party moving into full political manoeuvre and success.
And a lesson for today?
A lesson for today is this: preserve your sense of humour whatever else you do. Make sure that Scotland is going to be a laughing independent country who knows the tremendous importance of smallness, who will be totally against violence and totally in favour of being so proud of the history that is so often forgotten, and where so much exists in which to have a very real pride, including among people who don't get remembered, whether Hamilton and the others who took the stone, or alternatively, the various people who stood up to Edward I, standing up against him a lot more difficult than standing up against Edward II at Bannockburn.
Owen Dudley-Edwards, as I say, one of Ireland's greatest export to Scotland, a proud honorary Scot, and a great guest on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alec.
And now over to Tasmina, who has something really important to let us know about.
And with thanks, as usual, here are some of your responses to our recent festive shows, which you sent in to us via email, tweet, text, etc. Please do keep them coming in. Scotland the Brave says, "You're both fantastic people." Thank you, that's so sweet. "I've got an idea for the show. I was in the Edinburgh National Museum. All the Scottish stuff was stuffed away in a side section at the back. Alex, can we raise this issue? Why isn't Scottish history front and centre?" Charles says, "Laughter is the best medicine, thanks. Looking forward to hearing about the Stone of Scone from Alex and Owen. I'm sure this will be a classic." Scotland the Brave again says, "I'm going to watch the Scottish Heroes episode you made. Alex Salmond, you're the biggest patriot in the country alive today. You're incredible. I have your book, The Dream Shall Never Die. God bless you, and Sarah Alba." Well, Scotland the Brave, I'm not sure if you have a signed edition, but if you write into me and send me your copy, I'll make sure Alex signs it for you. Grant says, "The cats were the true professionals there." Well, I'm not sure that Grant's comment is meant to be positive, but I don't know. I don't mind kittens being in charge. They probably would have taken us to freedom by now if they had been. Patricia Duncan says, "He's the man. He can only get us freedom," obviously referring to Alex. 100% behind you, a great politician and orator. And finally, the lovely Pilar Fernandez says, "Bravo, you are the best. Happy New Year to all the team." And thank you very much indeed for these, and please do keep them coming in. Now you have one last and absolutely final chance to enter our big competition on Alex's top 3 hidden heroes. The task is simple. Out of the 14, select the top 3 which are Alex's favourite in any order and send them to us at the following address, theshow@alexsalmond.scot. Now make sure you include a suggestion on a new hidden hero for us to feature in a future show. Just to make it slightly easier, and please listen closely, Alex's choices involve trois dames and one very formidable, you might even say formidable, woman. Big clue. And today's Hidden Hero, sponsored by Flagship Media, is back for a brand new series, and this week, given the subject matter, is very appropriate for today's show.
In the democratic age, there's always been a tension between those people who saw the cause of Scotland principally as a movement, a national movement, and those who argued that it should be represented by a distinct political party or parties. Our subject for today's Hidden Hero is interesting. King John MacCormick, because basically he epitomised both. He's someone who in his earlier career saw the need for the cause of Scotland to be represented by a distinct political party, and then in later life decided that it was far better to move through the idea of a movement influencing the other established parties. John MacCormick was a remarkable man. He was a student at Glasgow University and heavily instrumental in the formation of the National Party of Scotland in the 1920s. He then was influential as he moved on to become a successful lawyer, as instrumental in the formation of the Scottish National Party, a merger between the National Party and the Scottish Party in the early 1930s. He was one of the leading organisers. He was one of the candidates who stood for elections in the 1930s, but disappointed with the lack of electoral success, although the votes were more than respectable in a number of elections. MacCormick's restless spirit moved to seeing how the scene of Scotland, the cause of Scotland, could be represented in a broad way in the political spectrum. So he would see the Second World War, a major fight against fascism, where he wanted the SNP to have a very distinct position supporting the war effort. But he would see the war as being that fight against fascism, but also an opportunity to establish Scottish nationalism as a legitimate part of the anti-fascist coalition, which would be recognised after the war by the established parties who would see the logic Scotland taking its place in the Commonwealth of Nations, being home rule within the Empire and the Commonwealth, and be re-invited back to take its proper place at the top table of the victors of the Second World War. So in the 1940s, moving away from the Scottish National Party, MacCormick founded various conventions and eventually the Scottish Covenant in the early 1950s. The idea was to mass as many signatures as possible to demonstrate to everyone that Home Rule was a popular and legitimate cause in Scotland, and then he believed that the other parties, Liberals in particular, but Labour and Conservative, would eventually agree and say, well, there's got to be another Scottish Parliament. We've got to reconvene the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Covenant was impressive. It gathered 2 million signatories in the early 1950s. I mean, some of these, of course, were probably Santa Claus or Robert the Bruce, but by and large, they were legitimate signatories of ordinary men and women in Scotland who were starting to be persuaded that it was time for Scotland to emerge out of the political shadows. MacCormick joined the Liberal Party. He stood in various elections for them. He wasn't successful again. He had got perfectly respectable votes, but he was never elected to a parliamentary office. He was, however, elected to be rector of Glasgow University, which in terms of nationalist politics in 1950 was a substantial success. And there's no doubt whatsoever that the genesis of the pinch, the repatriation of the Stone of Destiny by Ian Hamilton, who had been MacCormick's campaign manager in the rectorial election, was very much the genesis of MacCormick and the planning, as well as these gallant 4 Glasgow University students who on Christmas Day 1950 repatriated the Stone of Destiny to Scotland and set off a chain reaction which was significant in recovering national feeling in Scotland. John MacCormick was an interesting, hugely political, but in some ways more than political, certainly more than party political figure. To John MacCormick, political parties and tendencies were probably no more than instruments by which he could help fashion the Scottish cause and bring it to some fruition. In terms of inspiring a national covenant and a movement, in terms of moving Scotland, in terms of the great gestures like the repatriation of the Stone of Destiny, his court case where he questioned the right of Queen Elizabeth to have the title Queen Elizabeth II on postboxes, given that, of course, Scotland had never had a Queen Elizabeth I. These were the grand gestures by which MacCormick understood if you wanted to ignite and inspire national feeling, then you had to have the symbolism of making tilts, not at windmills, but tilts at the centres of power in Westminster. So MacCormick, both for that mobilisation and for his organisation, his restless ability to find a new way forward for Scottish nationalism was hugely important to the national movement. And his legacy through his family, that his son was a major figure. Professor Neil MacCormick in the Scottish National Party became a Euro MP, Regis Professor of Law at Glasgow University. And his other son, Ian MacCormick, became an SNPM Member of Parliament in the 1970s. The MacCormick family, and indeed his nephew Donald MacCormick, a major political commentator. The MacCormick family played an enormous role in the public life of Scotland in the second half of the 20th century. When you look at MacCormick's career, it's quite interesting to think that, someone who grew up in the Scottish National Party, cut my political teeth in the 1970s and 80s, and wondered about routes forward to independence. The more I read Flag in the Wind, MacCormick's autobiography, the more I realised that every route I was thinking of had been tried previously by John MacCormick, and tried successfully, not total success because it was a major mountain that had to be climbed, but made substantial inroads. And the more you realised it wasn't a particular magic bullet or mechanism that mattered, it was the process by which Scotland could start to think independently. The Scots who signed the Covenant were thinking independently. The Scots who pinched the stone were thinking independently. And John MacCormick was a great independent thinker. One final thought, why King John MacCormick? Well, people think it's because he was leader of the national movement for several decades. Actually, it was an epithet that was thrown upon him in debating at Glasgow University, where people were teasing him by saying, "Are you going to have a monarchy?" And someone shouted out, "Yes, we're going to have a king, and our king will be John MacCormick." You know what? He wouldn't have been a bad choice at all.
Well, welcome back to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond. So that is the modern history of the Stone of Destiny. But what of the ancient mystery? Alex speaks to author Andrew McLeod, who thinks that for the last 728 years, we've all been pursuing a replica.
And Andrew McLeod, no one better placed than yourself to get to the truth here, because you've written a book, The Stone of Destiny, and you've employed the great historical figures, Dr. Johnson and Bothwell, to search out the truth behind the stone.
Yes, that's correct, Alex. The popular theory is that Edward I, who's a bit of a psychopath, who stole the Stone of Destiny by violence in 1296, was fobbed off with a worthless block of sandstone, while the real Stone of Destiny, which is described by various medieval documents such as the Scottish Chronicon, as a block of marble which has been carved into the shape of an ornate throne, which is, of course, doesn't resemble at all the block of sandstone that we have now.
And of course, it would be quite suspicious if, in the mythology of the stone at least, if it came from the Holy Land to Ireland to Iona and then to Scone, for it to be a lump of Perthshire sandstone. That would rather give the game away, would it not?
Well, there are various competing theories. Of course, the legend is that it was taken out of Egypt by Queen Scotia, who is the original Queen of Scots, and carried to Scotland via Ireland and taken to Scone by Kenneth MacAlpin, who unified the Scottish nation as Alba. In 1843...
I like the sound of that, incidentally. Unified the Scottish nation with Alba. We'll try that again sometime.
Yeah. And of course, there it remained in Scone Abbey, and all the kings of Scotland were coronated upon it. But here's the thing, there's very little written about a coronation stone before it was stolen. It was only after it came to Westminster that English chroniclers began to associate it with this biblical stone, Jacob's pillow. And the theory behind that is that, of course, Edward wanted to give the stone a bit of, a bit of colour. So medieval spin doctors got to work and weaved in these myths and legends into the fabric of the stone to make it a much more impressive thing. We know that Edward II was a weak and ineffectual king, and Edward III was just a boy. So they needed some kind of story to strengthen their Plantagenet claim to the throne. But there's very little written about a coronation stone before it was stolen. So,
yes, but on the other hand, let me test one or two of these theories and let me know how Dr. Johnson got on with working this out. Obviously, and of some significance, because Bruce wanted it back and agreed in the Treaty of Northampton to get it back in 1328. So, even if it was just to even up the score, clearly the Scots at that stage attached some significance to getting it back, because it was in the provisions, or at least the codicil of the treaty, was it not?
Well, absolutely. But after it was associated with Jacob's Pillow, of course, there was competition between Scotland and England to gain credibility with the church in Rome. So after these stories had been spread, the Scots, of course, wanted it back. But I don't think even the Bruce was that keen to get it back. What not many people know is Edward didn't take it straight down to Westminster with him. He left it in Edinburgh Castle, and it languished there for about 7 years before he reluctantly dragged it back with him. And even then, he didn't build this magnificent throne to house it. It's almost like an afterthought that he built a wooden chair, the chair of Edward the Confessor, which is impressive enough, but it wasn't used as a coronation chair until, I think, Henry IV. So he didn't know what to do with it.
So, Andrew, that's the inconvenience of history. It interferes with some of our assumptions. But look, I'm putting you on the spot. You're the man who writes these historical detective thrillers, like the Stone of Destiny. You're the man who's researched it. So I'm asking you, is the real Stone of Destiny, is it in the River Tay? Is it in a Perthshire cave? Do the Knights Templar have it secreted away somewhere? Is it going to emerge surprisingly on the day of independence? Where is it?
Well, I don't know. I heard that you yourself had a small piece of it recently, which we could talk about later. But of course, my book, The Stone of Destiny, obviously there's so many competing theories. It's a fiction, so I go with the most interesting one, that there is a stone hidden somewhere, which Dr. Johnson and James Boswell go to investigate. Actually, they did go on a tour of Scotland, as you know, in 1773. And just by coincidence, a lot of the places they visited were places that the stone was reputed to be hidden, like Dunsinane and Scone Abbey. Apparently, some scholars believe it never left Scone Abbey. And of course, Iona, which is the centre of Christianity and medieval Christianity.
So what's your money on then, Andrew? Come on, I'm putting you on the spot here. Where is it?
Well, you have to read the book to find out. I have one theory of many, of course. The disappointing reality is there may not even be an actual coronation stone. It could be that Scots were crowned on a stone rather than the stone. But the fact is that Edward knew there must have been something, or he wouldn't have gone for it. So I think John Balliol was the last king to be crowned on the Stone of Destiny in Scotland. And certainly there would have been some English delegates present at the coronation. But again, there were no eyewitness accounts, and it's only until about 1320s that the coronation of John Balliol was described, seated upon a stone. So I believe there was something.
Well, of course, there's an old rhyme, Andrew. Our king won't come from London town, nor from Donegal, nor will he come from Scotland, because we'll have no king at all. Andrew McLeod, thank you so much for joining me on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you for having me.
Replacing the Labour Party as the dominant force, the fixture of the Scottish politics, the Goliath of the Scottish political scene, was a 25-year process. It took 25 years, a quarter of a century, and a clear-sighted strategy in order to bring this about and replace them with the Scottish National Party. It was a strategy that started in the 1980s and culminated in 2011 where in the Scottish election for the Scottish Parliament, the Labour Party was swept aside and the SNP emerged with an overall majority in a proportional parliament. That led to the Scottish referendum. The Labour Party's alliance with the Tories put the tin lid in it, and then they therefore disappeared as a significant political force in electoral politics in Westminster constituencies, with one and now two, of course, members of Parliament. That only happened because there was a clear-sighted vision of what we were trying to do. We realised it wasn't going to be enough to influence the Labour Party, to threaten the Labour Party. That was the process of the 80s and 90s, where the occasional SNP by-election victory moved the Labour Party further onto a Home Rule platform, saw about the resumption of the Scottish Parliament, the reconvening, as Winnie Ewing used to say, of the Scottish Parliament, and therefore the opportunity to win an election in Scotland. That, of course, was part of the process. But it was only going to work if you replaced the Labour Party, because you could only get a mandate for a referendum if you became the dominant force in the Scottish Parliament. Now, why do I recap that 25-year history? Because I'm in a position, as others are, people like Alec Leo and Jim Sowers and many others, people who are dead and gone now, like Margaret MacDonald, who had this clear-sighted vision of what had to be done, are now looking askance as we see people apparently offering to undo the work of 25 years and actually embracing a political argument which wouldn't distinguish those who believe in Scottish independence from those who believe in replacing the Tory party at Westminster. And therefore the SNP's latest campaign wheeze to cast the election, an election which is going to decide whether Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister or whether it's a Tory Prime Minister continues at Westminster, to recast it as being all about whether the SNP can beat the 7 or so Tories who are in Scottish constituencies. The election's not about that, and the difficulty with suggesting it's about that is pretty obvious. It means that you're saying that a Labour Party at Westminster is fundamentally different from a Tory party at Westminster. And if you give that message to people, why wouldn't people in Scotland go back to where they were 25, 30 years ago and say, well, in that case, why don't we just vote Labour? Now, the SNP say, oh no, it's much more sophisticated than that. What we're telling people is if they don't vote SNP this time, then everybody will forget about Scotland, or as Tommy Shepherd says, the cause of Scottish independence will be finished. I mean, can you imagine? The cause of Scottish independence, according to Mr Shepherd, is going to be finished if the SNP has a setback in an election at which they're not even contesting on independence. The truth is, the hard truth is, that the SNP had better very quickly go back to the drawing board on electoral strategy. They have a strategy in independence which is facing in two directions that's muddled. That's not me talking, that's Pete Wishart, the longest serving member of the Westminster Parliament, talking. Now, you know I haven't always agreed with Mr Wishart, but on the principle that even the blind squirrel must find the nut occasionally, on this occasion he's absolutely correct. You can't face two ways at once on your independence strategy. You have to have a strategy for getting to independence. And secondly, you have to find a way not to fight the election on the SNP's recent record in the Scottish Parliament, which has been at best indifferent and at worst somewhat worse than that. And therefore you have to fight basically on a principle of Scottish independence. Now, if you think about it, the reason for spending 25 years replacing the Labour Party, it wasn't just for the joy of seeing all these Labour place people get their comeuppance. I mean, that was a byproduct. The reason for doing it was to allow the people of Scotland to vote for independence in a referendum, and now that that's denied, to allow it to happen in a general election. So a national party, an independence party, which doesn't put that forward as a prospect from a position where half of the population now believe in Scottish independence, actually doesn't deserve to be thought of as a national party at all. A national party is not just an anti-Tory party. Most human beings are anti-Tory, or decent human beings are. A national party has to be a party which believes in Scotland to a sufficient extent as to allow the Scottish people to exercise their right of self-determination and to make Scotland independent. And if a national party doesn't offer that, and the SNP isn't offering it now, then it's heading towards the sands.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed our show this week as we've started our new series with new timings. Please do remember to enter the competition. We've given you so many clues, and this is your very last chance. There's some great memorabilia to win. Please give it a go. Now we look forward to seeing you next week at our new premiere time of 10 a.m. on Saturday mornings. Not to be missed. We shall see you then. Until then, take care and bye for now.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.